Hello again, everyone. You're joining us for another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint podcast series. My name is Jeff Mix. I'm Executive Platform's Head of Content and Research. My guest today is Mickey Desai. Mickey hosts the Nonprofit SnapCast podcast that talks about some of the challenges and opportunities unique to not-for-profit organizations. It's a terrific show that I think is going to be of interest to many of our listeners who sit on boards or otherwise contribute to charitable organizations, community associations, NGOs, and other not-for-profit groups. When we were talking about how I should introduce him, he joked I should call him the guy who has no idea what's happening, which isn't true at all, but it got a genuine laugh out of me. Outside of his work with nonprofits, I do want to mention what he does for a living. Mickey's helping the Office of Georgia's Secretary of State to automate and update a number of older IT systems. A big project that he's working on right now that will probably resonate with a number of our listeners is a Salesforce implementation, taking over for a 25-year-old piece of software responsible for Georgia's online application system across 160 different license types. I don't think we're going to be getting into that story on this episode, but I know how many people in our audience just felt a pang of sympathy and maybe a little stirring of excitement at a task like that. I'm sure we all wish him well with it. I do have one or two more interesting biographical items I'd love to get into at the end of the episode, but for now, why don't we get started? Mickey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thank you, Jeff. I'm happy for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
I'd like to start off by doing some myth busting about not-for-profit organizations. As I mentioned, quite a number of our listeners are board members or otherwise contribute to nonprofit groups. I think much of the public at large has a very dated and narrow view of what that kind of volunteer work looks like in this day and age. What are some of the big misconceptions you want to dispel for people?
I wrestle with the idea that people may be misinformed, and I don't want to insult any members of your listening audience. So I'm going to ask for their forgiveness in advance in case I'm preaching to the choir already. But there are many members of the choir who may not know what it means to be a board member. So let's just be aware that that's the audience that I'm speaking to right now. Um, I think that folks don't understand that being a board member for an organization is sort of its own part-time job, especially if it's a smaller to medium-sized organization. I think gone are the days where a board member can just show up and vote on the minutes once a month and then go home. The modern expectation for board members who really help a nonprofit organization move its mission forward in some direction. To do that, you have to understand what fiduciary responsibility is. You have to understand what you need to bring to the table in order to propel that organization towards success. A powerful board that can exercise good leadership skills in that way is going to really rocket their nonprofit to success. You'd be surprised how many nonprofits I meet with who don't know this or have board members who are sort of dead weight and don't help the organization in any meaningful way. And that's it's always sad to witness when that happens. But I tell whenever I do board trainings, I try to enlighten the board on what fiduciary responsibility is. And there's this saying that I use that is, there are two ways to say this. There's the pretty and polite way, and then there's the Mickey way. And the pretty and polite way is, if you're on a board, bring your time, your treasures, and your talents. And the Mickey way of saying this is, if you're going to be on a board, be a doer, a donor, and a door opener. And if you can't do all three of those things, please help find someone who can and invite them to join the board.
In your experience, what attracts business executives to volunteer their time and expertise to nonprofits?
The biggest thing by far and away is passion. It's a cause-driven effort. And there are some nonprofit, I'm sorry, there are some executives, not nonprofits. There are some executives who are just looking to do some sort of level of community service, and they can leverage their own contacts or leverage their own leadership skills to benefit a nonprofit. But I think that the best results are to find a cause that you really resonate with, something that you can really apply your passion to, and then serve them in that capacity. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's sort of a general question.
Yeah.
I would like to get into a few issues where helping people to lead a nonprofit is different than a for-profit organization. Why don't we start with human resources? And I appreciate we could have a whole episode on HR and nonprofit, but what are some of the unique or unusual HR issues that you have to keep in mind in the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. You could definitely dedicate an entire episode just to human resources in the nonprofit world, but we'll just scratch the surface real quick. And that is to say that a quick comparison between for-profit HR and nonprofit HR. I'm looking at some notes that I made here. Uh, For-profit HR generally operates from a place of generally sufficient resources. They're generally not underfunded, right? For-profit HR generally has project flexibility, and by that I mean for-profit organizations aren't limited in how they allocate and schedule their projects. They can table new initiatives when they're not profitable, and then for-profit HR generally has robust staff resources as well, so they generally have enough people to be dedicated to the role of HR, as opposed to a nonprofit, which in no particular order typically doesn't have a dedicated person just for HR. They have very limited resources in time and money. They have project-based staffing, which specifically means that nonprofits rely on program or project-specific grants, which makes staffing a logistically complex issue for an HR team because those have very different and finite expectations attached to them. And then volunteer management tends to be an issue for nonprofits. That's not the case for for-profits. Managing unpaid team members is a critically important task for nonprofits that the for-profit world generally doesn't have to do.
And what about finance? We have an annual North American Finance Executive Summit that's been running for a number of years now. And I know so many of those CFOs and other senior finance executives are also volunteering their time and expertise to worthy causes that they care about. What are some of the things that change for them when they're working for a not-for-profit rather than in their day jobs?
It's a good question, and this is my weakest area. So again, my apologies to your audience, but I think that you know, when it comes to talking nonprofit finance, there's a certain interdependence amongst governance, planning, and programs that requires very open and frequent communication amongst all levels of the nonprofit's structure, infrastructure in particular. So that kind of interdependence is certainly there. Budgeting is critically important for nonprofits. You need to have that at least a 1-year budget down for most grants. I encourage nonprofits to have a 5-year long-term budget, even if they're just making guesses beyond the first year. Program costs are very critical to monitor. The biggest thing for nonprofits, and here's where I'm not sure I'm answering the question anymore, but the biggest thing I think nonprofits have to consider is diverse fundraising sources. I've seen nonprofits who rely too heavily on one revenue stream. Usually that's some sort of events. They become event-driven fundraising machines, which is dangerous. Doing events by itself is a good way to go broke, and go broke in a hurry. So when we look at the fundraising pie chart, there are typically 3 or 4 slices in it. One is grants, one is individual gifts, one is maybe I can't, major gifts. My mind is blanking this morning. I should have had an extra cup of coffee, but we want to see as many slices in that pie as possible. At least judiciously as possible, right? Don't go nuts, but don't let one slice of that pie completely outsize any other slice of the pie. Keep it diversified. Keep every single one of those slices optimized and maximized. If you have a grants agenda, that's great. Make sure you don't lose the individual giving agenda. The individual giving portion of a fundraising enterprise is the single easiest way to get the most bang for your buck out of fundraising for any nonprofit. And I think a lot of nonprofits are scared of simply reaching into their Rolodexes and asking, as a starting point, asking their friends and family or a general community to make gifts and to maintain that database of givers to foster and steward the relationship with donors to benefit a nonprofit. The individual gifts easily the one critical thing that any nonprofit can do, and yet a lot of them look at that with a certain element of fear and trepidation. So,
I always think it's a good podcast episode when I'm surprised or I've learned something. And you actually just myth busted something for me. I thought you were going to talk about events as a tool for fundraising. And your first thought was like, don't go into this thinking events are how you do your fundraising. There's so many better options out there. So that's my biggest takeaway so far. And I appreciate you saying it. From that, why don't we pivot into talking about your podcast and your consulting work with nonprofits? Because
Sure.
right there is a piece of advice that if I were running a not-for-profit, I probably would say, let's get a big fundraiser together. And you say, whoa, there's better ways to do this. What
Well,
are some of the big things you talk about that we can highlight for our audience when on your podcast and your consulting work? What do you really bring to people's attention?
Well, the whole podcast is geared towards educating people and getting them out of their little comfort zones with regard to management and to look at different ways to manage their nonprofits. Before I get into that, I wanted to add related to the finance piece. We're talking about fundraising. There are a couple other things that people don't understand about nonprofit fundraising. Sorry about that. One is a friend of mine likes to say that nonprofit is not a business model; it is a tax status, uh, and definitely as a nonprofit, you have to run as a business, which means your expenditures cannot outpace your revenues. But also with the world of fundraising, I think a lot of folks don't know about fundraising ethics. You can't just hire someone to do commission-based fundraising for you. The Association of Fundraising Professionals has really excoriated people who do that, and saying to someone, oh, you can raise money for us and I'll just give you 15% of whatever you bring in, is a big no-no in the nonprofit world. And then the last thing before we go on with the nonprofit podcast SnapCast conversation is the reporting requirements for nonprofits are a little bit different. You still have to file at the end of every year. You still have to do your Form 990, which in some cases is quite complex, and in some cases is very easy. It depends upon the nonprofit itself and the size of their budget. But I think if you are an accountant, you already know this. If you are a finance genius, yeah, you probably know this. But most nonprofit board members may not know this, that the Form 990 is a requirement, and that you have to look at nonprofit as a business still, and even if it's a tax exempt one. So in any case, so I'm sorry about that little detour, but
No, it's great to add that, and let's please. I mean, you talk about that in your show. You talk about many things. Let's talk about your podcast.
yeah, the podcast is sort of anything goes as long as it has something to do with nonprofit management, and we've talked about everything from finance to volunteer management to strategic planning to
I heard an
fundraising.
episode on DEI. I actually, when we were talking about HR, I wondered if you're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the not-for-profit space.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that every organization, even for-profit ones, has to look at, is the issue of DEI these days. And the issue for the nonprofits is to make sure that your stakeholders are accurately represented within the governance structure of the organization. And I think that's just absolutely a wise thing to do. I'm not trying to peddle that information as being woke or in any way
If you're
part
trying
of
to
a
benefit a community, the community better be in the decision-making process.
precisely. It is simply the strategically correct thing to do. And people look at me and they're like, well, Mickey, I serve homeless people. I run a soup kitchen. Does that mean a homeless person should be on our board? And the answer is a resounding yes, absolutely. You should absolutely have a homeless person on your board. Well, does that mean that they have to give to the same level that a board member does? No, obviously have those conversations and set policies accordingly. But what you want is their voice. What you want is their participation and their perspectives of what it means to be someone who's receiving the services of the nonprofit. And their vote should definitely count as much as anyone else's at the board table. In the for-profit space, I haven't had a close-up look at how that works, but I think that we all know that diversity, equity, inclusion is something that people run away from or people raise an eyebrow at, but I still think it's critically important for the for-profit space to be looking at that as well. If to do nothing more but to give again, it's a matter of voice, right? It's a matter of representation and voice. People have their stories to tell. People have their unique experiences to bring to any table. And why wouldn't you want a diversity of experience at your table? The research shows over and over again that diverse audiences, non-homogeneous board members, actually perform better than a table that looks like each other.
That
or
was actually the
behaves like
point
each
I was
other.
just going to. I've had so many conversations about DEI in the for-profit space through my organization, Executive Platforms. And I was going to say there are so many studies and metrics that, like, if you get out of that monoculture echo chamber, we all feel and think and say the same way, you open yourselves up to all kinds of things that, you want your company to be great at, but you didn't have anybody who was bringing that insight into the conversation at the decision making. And of course, it's going to be the same for nonprofit. Of course, it's going to be the
Yeah,
same.
absolutely.
How long
Absolutely.
has your
So,
podcast been running?
oh gosh, I think somewhere upwards of 6 years now. I've lost track of time. I've been doing it sort of as a labor of love, and I've reached a point now where I'm looking at my listener numbers. Actually, I have two podcasts. I have the Nonprofit SnapCast, and then I have a hobby podcast called The Thing About Cars.
I promise
Um,
we're going to get into that towards
yeah,
the end. I've got a note about that. I think it's so cool, but let's do the nonprofit stuff first, and then we'll
yeah,
expand.
absolutely. No, the comparison I'm about to draw is that it's weird that the nonprofit Snapcast actually has an audience that's 3 or 4 times as large as the thing about cars for having used the same marketing strategy for both, which up to date has been simply word of mouth. So, given that the Snapcast is seeing that level of attention, I think it may be time to start looking for a sponsor. But it's just been a labor of love. I love talking to folks across the world. I've had audiences as far away as Australia and Austria. I had a three-way podcast with with me here in Atlanta, Georgia, one participant somewhere in Australia, and the other one somewhere in Austria. And I thought, holy mackerel, I'm spanning the planet with this phone call.
And all
Um,
A's.
right.
Well, that's
And it's just
terrific.
cool. Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
cool because I learn something every single time. And especially working with the nonprofit sector, I'm keenly aware that I'm talking to folks who are in their own way passionate about a cause. And and if there's any direct way to help make the world a better place, most nonprofits are doing that work. Um, and I just love the opportunity to help them try to do that better and to help make the world a better place more efficiently or more powerfully. And that's why I do the Snapcast.
I think that pivots perfectly into my next question, which is, at the top of the show, we were talking about myth busting. And one of the biggest things that I think people get wrong about nonprofits is imagining they are somehow static things where they do not change over time. What excites you most about the nonprofit sector today, and how is that going to continue to evolve?
Uh, this is a difficult question to answer in terms of gauging the evolution of the nonprofit sector. I've heard conflicting pieces of research that say, on the one hand, the overall pool of available funds for nonprofits is shrinking. And I've heard the diametric opposite, which is to say there's more to do with funding opportunities in the nonprofit world than ever before. I don't know which of those is true. Um, I think what needs to happen is that as the evolution of nonprofits moves forward, is that you're going to see good old Darwinism in effect. The fitter nonprofits will be able to pivot and be flexible with the world in general as time marches on, right? As cultural circumstances change, as funding priorities change. Good nonprofits will roll with the punches and pivot as necessary to make those changes. The nonprofits that fail won't be showing that same kind of flexibility, won't have the leadership to guide organizations through calamity, won't have the leadership to diversify their fundraising streams. Um, that's why board leadership is so critical. That's the engine that powers the entire machine is your board. And if you don't have good participation amongst the board, and if you have an executive director that has poor relationships with the board, and by poor, I don't mean combative or drama ridden or, strife. Poor means you're sitting on your hands and you're not doing your job. Um, or you're too relaxed about what you have to do from a day-to-day basis. I'm not saying be stressed out, but I'm saying again that being a board member is at least a part-time job, and you have to be feeding your executive director, who has that full-time job, the right direction, the right policy, the right governance to help move that organization forward when things need to change. I hope I've answered your question. I
You
think I'm
you
just.
have, and actually, I'm sort of waiting for a second to jump in to say, I have a lot of very similar sounding conversations because I'm speaking to people in a business space about a given thing. And so this has been so fascinating to me. I didn't know how you were going to answer that question, but it resonates with so much of what I've heard in so many other conversations. You're talking about resilience and agility and the ability to live through turbulent times. There is so much of that happening in the for-profit space. Of course, it's happening in the nonprofit space, and what a great thing to highlight as like this is a key thing that is happening right now, and boards need to be thinking about it. Mickey, we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. I do want to talk about your other projects. I think they're fascinating. But just before we wrap up the nonprofit piece, if there was one or two key takeaways you want people to think about further, what would you want to highlight for them?
Oh, again, if we're talking to your audience, that may be people who are board members or nonprofit managers, absolutely keep on doing the good work that you're doing. Making the world a better place is definitely an honorable goal. And if I can help move that agenda forward in any way, please don't hesitate to give me a call. But the key takeaways I would give are, again, diversify your fundraising streams and make sure you have good and transparent communication amongst board members and amongst executive directors. One of the things there are two things that I do for board members when I consult for them. And one change is that I ask nonprofits to put their mission in the footer of their agenda for their board meetings, just to remind their board members exactly why they're there every time they sit down and look at the agenda for a board meeting. And the second thing is build in some socializing time around your board meetings. Make sure that if the meeting starts at 7, that they know they can gather at 6:30, have a bite to eat, have something to drink, and just talk to each other with no real governance agenda at hand. I think that building that little bit of social time either before or after a meeting is actually more important than people realize to building an effective team and to helping grease the wheels of nonprofit organizations. And those are the 2 points that I'll leave with on the nonprofit agenda.
And what a great couple of takeaways to highlight. I encourage everybody who is like, well, that makes a ton of sense. He has a whole podcast about this, folks. We will plug it again at the end, but it's a great show, and he's doing great work for people who are doing great work. So, with that said, just before I let you go, when we were first getting to know one another, you mentioned two other projects you have going on in your life, and I don't know if anyone listening to this is in a position to help you out, but I'm happy to give you an opportunity to talk about your passions. You run another podcast called The Thing About Cars that you think would make a great television show, and you're also a board game designer. So tell us about that, and don't feel you got to limit yourself. You got a couple minutes here, whatever you want to say.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's no secret that I'm a geek, first of all, so I'm happy to wear that badge. The thing about cars is me and a handful of friends that like to gather around a microphone and geek out about cars for 40 minutes at a time. We've been doing that for also upwards of 6 years. The audience is pretty involved. We get plenty of listener feedback about our show. I call it the Jerry Seinfeld of car shows. We talk about anything as long as it has something to do with being on the road or being driving. So, we talk about EVs, infrastructure, law, bad traffic, aggressive drivers, turning off your flashers in the rain because that's a silly idea and a dangerous one. Stuff like that. Anything goes as long as it has something to do with cars. But in the end, people want to see what you're working on. People want to see what you're driving. I would love to meet a producer, a television producer who could help us turn that into a show and pitch it. That would be a dream come true. And you're right. The other thing is board game design. I fell into that by accident. I have never been a big board gamer. The board gaming world is exploding these days. It's kind of shocking how many games are on the market. I recently learned that over 2,000 games a month are being produced in this country alone. 2,000 new titles alone are being released in this country. And I'm like, holy mackerel, that's huge. Games that you've never heard of. Gone are the days where you just go to Target and you pick up your favorite copy of Trivial Pursuit and you go home with it. There's so many game mechanisms and so many stories to be told in the gaming world. But I'm more of a role-playing game guy. I'm a good old-fashioned Dungeons and Dragons nerd. So designing a board game has been a very interesting experience, and now I have this fully functional prototype that I'm trying to take to game publishers and see if I can get it published. I'm working on version 2 of the game. Version 1 is completely competitive game that's designed for adults because it has something to do with a nightclub. And yeah.
Yeah, both of those sound like amazing projects. So if and when you move to the next step with them, I hope you can come back and tell us more about them.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, it's been an interesting and also a big learning experience for both of those. So if any of your listeners have the ability to help me meet a television producer, I would be very grateful for that contact.
For sure. So, for people who want to listen to the Nonprofit SnapCast or learn more about how to effectively run not-for-profit organizations, what is the best way to find you?
Oh, easily. The Snapcast is at nonprofitsnapcast.org. Failing that, my consultancy website is nonprofitsnapshot.org. And I'm on LinkedIn. Just search for Mickey Desai. I think I'm the only one in Atlanta. And LinkedIn generally works as good as email when I'm not heavily involved in helping the Secretary of State fix things.
Well, again, I encourage everyone who has enjoyed this episode to give what Mickey is doing a listen, maybe reach out to him. And if you're interested in cars or board games and think you might be able to help Mickey with his other projects, be sure to reach out about that as well. Mickey, thank you so much for your time today.
Jeff, thank you. This has been a good experience. I hope we can do it again sometime.
I hope so too. I don't hope so. I look forward to the next time we get to do this. I know just before we started recording, you're like, we could do a whole thing on HR. I'm like, if you find value in doing this, we will do another episode on HR for nonprofit. I think it is worthy of a whole episode. But for now, why don't I say, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint podcast series. I've been Jeff Mix. Let's do it again soon.